The first step that JFK had to face in his run for president was being chosen by the Democratic Party as their member for the general election. He had to face the vote of the convention against Lyndon B. Johnson, as well as a few other prominent names of the time. Although he differed from some of the key Democratic Party ideals, he won the nomination. He then had to face off against the Republican nominee Richard Nixon in the general election. In the first televised presidential debate ever, JFK and Nixon faced off, speaking on issues of both national and international importance.
We discussed tonight domestic issues, but I would not want that to be any implication to be given that this does not involve directly our struggle with Mr. Khrushchev for survival.
After undertaking the role as president, Kennedy had many matters to attend to, both domestic and foreign. The main threat, however, was the Soviet Republic and their ongoing threats and actions taken against America. The first problem occurred during what was called the Bay of Pigs, which was an invasion of Cuba to try and rid the island of communism. The failed attempt further strained the U.S.-Cuba relations that were strained even before the attempted coup. Just a month after the Bay of Pigs invasion, another communist threat was poised to destroy the United States. The Soviets had moved missiles to Cuba and had armed them to attack America. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. He had to develop a way to resolve the issue without angering both of the parties involved on the Soviet side, the USSR and Cuba. What was devised was a military quarantine of all military equipment and weapons. Since blockades were illegal by international law, this was the most punishing act they could take without outright declaring war. 13 days in which this was occurring was the tensest of all in American history. While all of this was occurring, the U.S. and the USSR were both in an arms and space race in order to feel more powerful than the other. JFK had to show the world that the U.S. was on top, despite the military failures happening simultaneously. Following the USSR sending a man into orbit and having him return without ailments, JFK was faced with a problem in that it seemed communism was more successful than capitalism. This prompted an urgent letter written to the vice president. JFK wrote, "Do we have a chance of beating the Soviets by putting a laboratory in space, or by a trip around the moon, or by a rocket to land on the moon, or by a rocket to go to the moon and come back with a man? Is there any other space programs which promises dramatic results in which we could win?" Soon after, the United States launched the Mercury Redstone 3 into space with Alan Shepard aboard, proving that America had the technology and the capability of the Soviets. The U.S. government had put America back on the top. Everything came to an end on November 22, 1963, when Kennedy's life was cut tragically short by the bullet of an assassin. While riding his convertible limousine, Kennedy was shot in the head by Lee Harvey Oswald. President Kennedy was first struck by a bullet which entered at the back of his neck and exited through the lower front portion of the neck. The president was struck a second time by a bullet which entered the right portion of his head, causing a massive and fatal wound. While Jackie was sitting right next to him, the only damage that she experienced was emotional. Oswald was almost immediately arrested for his actions. However, his incarceration was quick. Club owner Jack Ruby walked into the police station and shot Oswald in the chest, killing him. Just like that, Oswald was gone, as he had done to the president. What would come next was a lasting memory of a beloved president killed by a crazy man in Dallas.
When the beloved President Kennedy was assassinated, America was heartbroken over this loss. During this shock and grief, the television brought people together during this difficult time. Like a parent reacting to the death of a child, America was traumatized over the assassination. In fact, all of the television networks suspended regular programming to provide viewers with nonstop coverage of the events that took place over the next 4 days. This was one of the major social impacts of his death, the switch from using radio and newspaper to using the television. Of course, newspapers were still publishing what occurred on November 22, 1963, and people still listened to the radio for coverage on the event. But the extensive coverage of the events surrounding Kennedy's assassination and funeral helped turn TV into a dominant source of news and information. But most importantly, President Kennedy was considered one of the best presidents in U.S. history. So though America was heartbroken over his tragic death, his legacy will forever be carried on by others. When Kennedy passed away, any mistakes he made during his presidency were forgotten, while his successes were praised. America saw in President Kennedy, the youngest elected president, a symbol of rebirth, hope and change at the beginning of a new decade. This symbol they saw represents his goals and aspirations as a president. His legacy was to better humanity and to better America. President Kennedy once said, "One person can make a difference, and everyone should try." This is something many people remembered about him, that he was one man who made a difference. This legacy transferred from one man to another. His brother, Robert F. Kennedy, was the man who is carrying on the legacy of the recently passed president. One can imagine that after the death of his brother, Robert wanted to remind the public and the world how amazing his older brother really was, and he did this by doing what he could to carry on John's legacy. One of the ways he did this was by running against Lyndon B. Johnson in 1968. Unfortunately, he had the same fate as his brother and was assassinated. Up until that point, however, he carried the family torch and continued to strive for the greater good, making a difference. The legacy of President Kennedy can also be seen in today's politicians. Some say that he redefined the art of campaigning for the White House. One important way his legacy is still used in politics is through the television. As we know, President Kennedy and Richard Nixon were the first candidates to have their debates broadcasted over television. Kennedy was aware of the fact that he would be on television and took advantage of his youth, good looks, charm, strong speaking skills, and attractive family to create an appealing television image through his campaign and presidency. Meanwhile, Nixon looked rather sloppy. This is one of the reasons Kennedy won the presidency. He had the appearance of a well-put-together politician. Candidates in today's era realize that the importance of the media's perspective of them has grown. Another way Kennedy's legacy can be seen in today's politics is through the primaries. Before the 1960 election, candidates did not use them to their advantage. By winning the states in the primaries, Kennedy proved that he could accumulate votes. Politicians today use the same strategy as he did in the 1960s. Lastly, Kennedy's legacy can be seen in today's politicians through the speeches of tolerance. In his speeches, Kennedy spoke directly about why his Catholicism shouldn't bar him from the presidency. This speech has inspired future candidates such as Barack Obama and Mitt Romney to state that being minorities doesn't mean that they will be bad presidents. The final aspect of Kennedy's legacy is not a concept, but rather a thing, the Warren Commission. This commission was created to investigate the assassination of President Kennedy and is still around today. After 10 months of interviewing hundreds of people, the group came up with a report going through step by step what happened on that day. The last step states, on the basis of the evidence before the commission, it concludes that Oswald acted alone. This gave people a peace of mind so that they could remember their beloved president for his accomplishments rather than the mystery of his assassination. Like most traumatic events, the assassination of President Kennedy led many conspiracy theories to take form. Many people believe them to be true. A poll taken back in 2013 states no less than 62% of Americans believe there was a broader plot beyond just Lee Harvey Oswald on the 6th floor overlooking Dealey Plaza in Dallas, even though the Warren Commission declared that it was Lee Harvey Oswald who committed the crime. However, post-assassination of the president led to the media coming up with some interesting theories. One of the first theories is not about the president's assassination, but rather his presidency. It is about Marilyn Monroe. It is said that John Kennedy met Marilyn Monroe as early as 1951 and that the relationship continued while he was president. Marilyn also began a relationship with the president's brother, Robert Kennedy. Now, since Marilyn was a celebrity at this time, she was often bugged so that the media could listen to her conversations. This led to the brothers being blackmailed in order to keep their affairs a secret. On August 5th of 1962, Marilyn was found dead in her home, authorities claiming it was suicide. The conclusion given was that Monroe swallowed a lethal dose of sleeping pills. The theory is that Marilyn did not commit suicide, but rather she was killed by the order of the Kennedy brothers to keep their affairs a secret. The next conspiracy theory states that there were multiple shooters on the day of President Kennedy's assassination. In 1964, the Warren Commission stated that there was only one shooter. However, after the Watergate incident in 1967, Americans were losing faith in their government and demanded more investigation into the president's death. This led to the House of Representatives to establish a select committee on assassinations and reinvestigate the killing. At the end of the investigation, the committee said there was probably a conspiracy involving a second gunman on the now infamous grassy knoll. However, they declared that it was most likely not true. Next, there is a theory that the assassination was an inside job or that the CIA was in on it. The theory states that the fatal bullet actually came from the driver of Kennedy's own car as he attempted to fire upon Oswald. Author of JFK Assassination Logic, How to Think About Claims of Conspiracy, says that if you look at a really bad copy of the Zapruder film, it will look like William Greer, the driver, reached over his shoulder with a gun and shot Kennedy in the head. However, that is only if you look at a bad film, and since Jackie Kennedy is in the car with the president, this theory is somewhat discredited, because she would have most likely told the media who really shot her husband. This leads to a more popular theory that the CIA and Lyndon B. Johnson were involved in the president's death. It is believed that Johnson had Kennedy killed so that he could become president himself. However, this, along with many other theories, has no evidence. Another speculation that occurred after his death arose from photographs that were released following the shooting. It depicted a man dressed in black holding what appeared to be an umbrella. This photo caused controversy because on the day that JFK was killed, there was not a cloud in the sky. He was later interviewed and claimed that the umbrella was only to heckle Kennedy for his father's appeasement of a Nazi-appeasing prime minister. While there has been many claims made in the recent years as more details and descriptions come out about that fateful day, still none have been proven to be true. Sadly, the world will most likely never see any of these claims validated due to the secretive nature surrounding the assassination. All in all, the presidency of JFK led to a lasting change in American politics as well as a large amount of controversy after his sudden death.